Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Fudge, for being here. I know it's been a very long day. I was looking over everything you inherited. Before you showed up, the just challenges really across the country in the housing crisis. And I know you know this because you come from a very similar county that I do, from the foreclosure crisis to the lack of housing to the conditions of housing. I mean, I just look at the average renter now pays over 30% in their income and rent. You know the housing prices are up like 47% since 2020. And, you know, funding for your agency continues to lag behind. I look at the number of households who receive federal rental assistance through public housing Section 8 programs, which you know are some of our working class families, is lower now today than it was 2 decades ago. And so more than 19 million households qualify for rental aid, yet only 4.3 million actually receive that assistance because of the lack of funding. So I want to talk specifically about the importance of, you know, public housing stock that faces like the capital backlog, the capital improvements that are needed. I think we need like, what, $70 billion?
Or more.
Or more. You only get, what, I think 3 or 4% of that. Is that correct?
Correct.
So then I look at Detroit Housing Commission, and I've talked to you about this, for example, needs hundreds of millions of dollars, and they only have right now about 12 million annually to spend on those improvements. So you have roughly 30% fewer employees than you did a decade ago. Secretary Fudge, can you talk about the struggles again? Because even with the reforms that many of colleagues want to see, and I hear a lot about new construction and everything, you need the capacity within your agency to address those changes and address some of the needs that many of my colleagues mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about how critical it is for us to really understand that, you know, funds and resources are needed?
I would say just a decade or so ago, HUD and housing made up 7% of the federal budget, discretionary budget. Mm-hmm. Today it is 1%. And so then it was a priority. Housing was a priority at that time. It is not anymore because we don't put the resources behind it to make it a priority. So until we can get back to a point where we realize that the only way to solve this problem is to preserve the housing we have, to bring public housing up to speed, to hopefully build more public housing, and to encourage the market to build more low-income and moderate-income housing, we will not get out of this because we no longer make it a priority.
And, you know, with the little resources that we have and the crisis just getting bigger and worse every time we don't fund it properly and make it a priority, one of the things I struggle with is I have a lot of housing commissions throughout my community and district, is that they're making a lot of really important decisions about the limited funding that they have. And so, you know, it's something I talked to you about, Secretary Fudge, but, you know, currently HUD offers a free online training for all the, you know, public housing agency board members called Lead the Way. Yep. The training covers topics like governance and financial management, super important. Again, all of it's currently optional. Do you think Lead the Way training should be required for all public housing administration executive directors, board members, commission members? Again, especially if they're now scoring or having troubles within the public housing assessment system right now.
Well, I'm not sure that I say it should be required because clearly that's up to the local governments. But what I would say is that they should be encouraged to take the training that is available or have our staff, we're happy to come in and do a training. We have technical assistance in every single community in this country. It is important that they know what they are dealing with because I think that the more knowledge you have, or like the old people used to say, if you know better, you do better. Mm-hmm. And I think that it is important that they understand what they are doing and what the consequences are of not having.
And the responsibility. And Secretary Fudge, many of them are appointed by mayors. They're appointed by bodies, and they think it's some sort of, you know, they don't realize the incredible responsibility that we gave it to them, for them to self-determine what they believe is a priority. And one of the things I've mentioned to you, again, if Detroit Housing Commission continues to struggle, and I understand now, as of 2023, Detroit Housing Commission has a substandard public housing assessment system designation. What can I do? I mean, you've been in my position. people need housing and they can't get in them because of backlogs and so many other things and the conditions of some of the housing that I have in my district. What can we do together to fix it?
I would love to come or send someone to your district to sit down with the people who make these decisions and have a conversation.
Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has.
Secretary Yellen, and I ask for your forgiveness. We're now 8 minutes past the time. In order to have partisan balance, Ms. Tlaib is here, and I think it would be appropriate if we can allow her to ask 5 minutes.
Certainly will.
We did start a few minutes late, so thank you for that, Secretary Yellen. We'll go to Ms. Tlaib for the final set of questions for today, then we will adjourn immediately after.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. As you know, Secretary, non-bank financial companies like AIG, Lehman Brothers played a large role in the 2008 financial crisis. And that crisis disseminated the U.S. economy, causing millions of our families to lose their jobs, their homes, or both. And I know in my district, including Wayne County and broader southeastern Michigan, I mean, we saw employment fall 51% for low and moderate income households. The median home value for low and moderate homes plummeted like 53%. Countless families, as you know, lost their homes to foreclosure. We had the worst tax foreclosure crisis in Wayne County. When the pandemic hit, another financial crisis emerged seemingly overnight, and again, liquidity pressures on vulnerable and over-leveraged shadow banks contributed to the market volatility. The risks posed by such companies have not been addressed. Today, non-bank financial intermediaries, I think they call them, broadly defined, are responsible for 60% of credit provided to the U.S. economy. And so, Secretary Yellen, can you discuss the size of the so-called shadow banking sector and its interconnections with the traditional banking sector?
Well, the shadow banking sector is very large, and we are very focused on potential risks. I agree with your assessment that much of the damage, not all of it, but much of it during the financial crisis arose from this so-called shadow banking system. And in part, FSOC was created in order to try to address those risks. So it is very high on our agenda. We have a variety of tools to do so, and we've identified a number of areas that give us concern. Some of those were the areas, as you mentioned, in March of 2020, where we saw problems. And there were open-end bond funds.
So, Secretary, but given the size of non-banks, their interconnectedness, the incentives they face, I greatly appreciate your leadership in establishing FSOC's new guidance on the designation of non-banks as systematically important. I completely agree. The question now turns to implementation, which implementation matters. So, Secretary, so 0 non-banks are currently designated as systematically important. Do you believe that no non-bank financial institution is systematically important?
So very often, the financial stability risks are not created by an institution, but rather by market-based practices within a market. For example, money market funds have been a problem both recently and in the crisis. And to deal with those risks, it's not appropriate to just choose 1 or 2 large money market firms, money market funds to designate. I don't think designation is the right tool. I think an approach that regulates the practices in the industry is appropriate. So the so-called activity-based approach, that is what the SEC has been pursuing in that space. Sometimes it is appropriate to designate a firm when it creates risks, but in other situations,
I know, it's just, what I hear is the different regulatory environments that we're creating. I mean, what does it mean? What is regulatory, was it arbitrage? What does that mean?
regulatory arbitrage means that
What is that?
when one sector is regulated, that a kind of activity that becomes more expensive to conduct through that sector moves to a less regulated part of the economy. But this isn't always about individual firms. It's often about a group of firms or an industry.
Or maybe a culture.
It might be a culture, but often it's many firms and not just one or two firms that are responsible for the problems.
Yeah. And I just want FSOC, of course, it was important for you, and thank you for your leadership on that, but it has to fulfill its total responsibilities when it talks about protecting our residents, especially our low-income and underserved communities from the systematic risk, as you know, and financial instability that result from the failure of the mega banks and financial. So describe, I mean, what specific actions, maybe you talked to some of my colleagues about this already, has FSOC really taken or plans to take in full responsibility in protecting those families? Again, I'm looking at these and trying to learn about these process in the culture, as I call it.
Gentlelady's time's expired, and if the secretary could answer for the record in writing, that would be sufficient.
Okay, I will answer for that.
Yeah, I want to learn more. Thank you. I know that many of you, both of you have talked about this, but in general, the incredibly important role that you all have, and especially around the real estate industry, has been a very attractive target for corrupt foreign actors seeking to hide their money by paying with cash or relying on shell companies, as you know. We already know, and my colleagues should know this, 20 to 30% of residential real estate purchases in our country is not financed, and therefore do not face the same level of anti-money laundering oversight as other more common transactions, as we know. Again, it should ring alarms for many of my colleagues. Huge influxes of illicit cash can distort markets, as you know, further incentivize developers to build luxury real estate and commercial properties instead of affordable housing. That's also something that I put aside as something that's important. Consider rentals, for instance. Criminals often make bad landlords. In some cases, buildings sit vacant for years, and others, residents pay the price as rents go up and services decline. In FinCEN's proposed residential real estate rulemaking, thank you, by the way, you touched on some of the dynamics. The notice stated, quote, while money laundering may appear to be concentrated in high-end real estate properties in luxury markets, it's a spillover effect that if left unchecked, could in some instances disproportionately affect low-income and otherwise high-risk communities. Director, can you unpack this statement a bit and help us understand how money laundering worsens the housing crisis and impacts communities like mine?
Oh, thank you, Representative Tlaib. I just want to, stress that the flow of illicit money into the residential real estate sector, I think, as that statement notes, raises the costs of the real estate sector altogether. Allowing illicit actors to store their money in this could have an effect that disadvantages homeowners across the country. And so we feel that this is an important measure, not only for, to stem the flow of illicit finance, but also is an overall benefit to the residential housing sector in the nation.
Yeah, so rulemaking is not enough. Implementation matters, right? And it's going to take resources. FinCEN needs to roll out the new reporting form, as you know, conduct stakeholder outreach, engage in compliance monitoring, among other activities. This requires, again, resources. I know many colleagues on this committee, the House Republicans have proposed $166 million in FinCEN for 2024. Director, would this level be sufficient enough in implementing the rule successfully?
And thank you, Representative. I want to stress that we are grateful for the support we've received, but this funding amount does fall short of the president's budget, and I think we need full funding to be able to adequately implement, including not just issuing a proposed rule, but bringing it to final, putting in place all the necessary forms and all the outreach necessary to make sure it's effective across this and other regimes that we have to implement.
So I commend, this move and which will bring a much needed transparency to our housing market. I also encourage you to advance similar requirements in the commercial real estate sector, where the lack of transparency puts tenants at risk and serves as a huge loophole for criminals to park money in U.S. real estate in our country. Director, can you commit today in finalizing the crucial rule by this September?
Congressman Tlaib, this is something we are definitely looking at next in commercial real estate. I can't commit at this time, but we'll be happy to work with you and your staff to make sure you're updated on our efforts.
All right. Thank you, and I yield.
The gentleman,
Time has expired.
We'll
The
be
gentleman-
following up on the Taylor rule. So.
The gentlelady from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Tlaib.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Thank you, Chair Powell, for being here. Do you agree with the April Federal Reserve report that compensation incentives contributed to Silicon Valley's bank failure?
I'm sorry, did I didn't
So the April Federal Reserve report, it said that compensation incentives contributed to the Silicon Valley Bank's failure. Do you agree with that?
I would say it's at best a tertiary factor, but it probably had something to do with it. For me, not a
So
major.
that's no?
That's very small.
Okay, so it did, okay. So do you agree the appropriate rules on incentive compensation could have reduced the likelihood of Silicon Valley's failure? Maybe? You know, if they didn't take
No,
all that
I
money?
really don't think so. I mean,
So if they
I don't
didn't take
think
all
it's a-
that money?
I don't think it's a first-order question for Silicon Valley. A lot went wrong there.
Yeah,
Incentive comp would be
they actually blame
way
you
down the
guys.
list.
They
Sorry.
blame the oversight, even though they didn't respond to your
part of it.
correspondences.
We took our medicine.
Yeah. Do you think it also has something to do with the fact that Section 956 of the Dodd-Frank rule hasn't been finalized by you?
No, I don't.
You don't think it's the reason?
I don't.
You don't think it's because people made money off of the failure?
I think nothing.
You don't think money drove them to do what they did?
I didn't say that. What I said, you know, there are lots
So
of.
they made money from it. They actually, it was a lottery
I
for
do not
them,
think
right?
that incentive compensation arrangements were at the heart of the Silicon Valley Bank failure. No.
Okay. Do you support a robust rulemaking for executive compensation, Chairman?
I know that the.
Oh, you don't?
I'm sorry?
Oh, this is, do you support robust rulemaking for executive compensation? Do you believe in Section 956?
Section 956 is the law. As I understand it, the agencies are looking at doing something. It's been 12 or 13 years, right?
Yeah, multiple
Nothing
agencies.
has happened.
Yeah.
It's been hard to get it done. I lived through the last episodes of trying
Yeah.
to get it done.
So do you believe in a robust
I
rulemaking
believe-
process for executive compensation?
I do, yeah.
Oh, great. Oh, that's awesome. Will you commit to helping finalize the Dodd-Frank section of 956 this year?
I wouldn't
It's been
say that.
12 years, Chairman.
Yeah, no, I want.
It played a role in the bank failure, Chairman.
If I can answer, what I would like to do is
So you don't want to do it this year? I mean, I'm being serious. You're saying no?
If the member will allow the witness to answer the question, we've had a good day today, and the gentleman's trying to answer the question.
I would like to understand the problem we're solving, and then I would like to see a proposal that addresses that problem.
Okay. Do you believe people should profit off of bank failure? The executives that made those decisions?
No, not the executives.
They should not profit.
Well, I would say executives who are responsible for a failed bank should not profit from the failure, absolutely not.
So they get to walk away with compensation based on their failure?
Well, you're asking
true, it
about a different rule that would have clawback and things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's something I know you've been looking at for a while.
Yeah.
That's certainly an appropriate thing to look at.
Yeah, because it's just going to continue to happen, is my opinion. It doesn't have to be yours, but it sure the heck could have helped here if they knew they were going to walk away, if they could walk away with not the bonuses, the compensation. I mean, they made money, a significant amount of money for their bank failure. Last question, Chair Powell. Do you believe that the impacts of climate change pose a risk? Have you been talking about that more?
I certainly believe that climate change is real and poses risks over the longer term, sure.
So there have been some that say, higher interest rates actually makes it more difficult to build out the renewable energy projects and other investments required to prevent climate impacts. Do you believe that to be true?
It's not I believe that we need to do our job that you've assigned us, which is maximum employment and price stability, and we do it through interest rates. It's not our job to consider the effect on climate change of that, and I think any effect on climate change of that would be kind of minuscule.
Okay. Last question, Chair Powell, who do you see as the major winners and losers from high interest rates in terms of income groups, age groups, and racial or other demographics?
So the point of high interest rates in the current environment is to bring inflation under control. The people who are hurt the most by inflation, as you know, are people who are on a fixed income, who right away are in trouble when the cost of transportation, food, energy, and when those things go up, they don't have financial resources to deal with it.
Have you looked
We're
at the-
accountable to provide price stability to the American people. Those people benefit the most over time from stable prices.
Gentlelady's time's expired. We'll go to the gentlelady.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back. Gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, the question is, how can you address a problem that you can't see? So one longstanding issue, and I know I feel like maybe some of my colleagues have brought it up, is documented in both the 2020 Inspector General Report and the Cleary Report, was the lack of centralized database tracking and documenting harassment claims and the investigations at the FDIC. And before, I think, 2020, the internal records were maintained in like a hard copy file system held by specific individuals there and stored electronically in FDIC's, what they call the Corporate Human Resources Information System, CRIS. So from 2008 to 2021, the CRIS system documented only 2 cases. From 2008 to 2021, the CRIS system documented only 2 cases of sexual harassment and just 7 cases of harassment. Mr. Kim and Ms. Mayno, given that 2009 Office of Inspector General survey found that 8% of FDIC respondents had experienced sexual harassment from 2015 to 2019, is there any reason to believe that CRIS database records from 08 to 2021 were complete or accurate?
There's no reason to believe that the CRIS database was complete.
Okay. In terms of tracking workplace misconduct, how would you characterize the FDIC's data collection and management practices for both of you?
Currently,
Yes.
we understand that the group within the Human Resources division at the FDIC, within the Division of Administration, has taken steps more recently to improve centralized and systematic record keeping. In the past year, we
Is this
understand.
based on their action plan? Is this,
No, this actually predates the action plan.
okay.
We understand that in the past year, that group specifically has introduced a system that now tracks different types of interpersonal misconduct so that it allows the FDIC to identify sexual harassment, for example, compared to hostile work environment, and also identifies whether misconduct falls under the FDIC's anti-harassment program, which the records before did not do.
So, and I'm not rolling my eyes at you, it's just really bizarre that they would do it. So FDIC's December 2023 action plan, Mr. So, one of the stated goals was to, quote, enhance the centralized tracking system for monitoring sexual harassment claims. The projected completion of this was February 29th of this year. So either Mr. McKernan or Mr. Sue, has this action item been successfully completed? If so, what specific steps were taken to improve the FDIC's ability to track misconduct?
I'm not aware of whether it's actually completed, and even if we're saying it's completed, I won't believe it until I see some independent validation that it's completed.
So I agree with Director McKiernan. The completion of the action plan for that particular database, it's only going to work if people feel safe to
I see.
report. And
There's
that's
no
a really,
trust.
that's the
Yeah,
fundamental
makes
thing that
sense.
needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I actually talked to him about that. People have lost a lot of trust. So staying on the topic of collecting and tracking information, 2021 Office of Inspector General report found that FDIC does not have a systematic or process for collecting, right, or analyzing employee retention data, for instance. According to the Cleary report, FDIC revised its retention tracking process in 2023. So either Mr. Sue or Mr. McKernan, what is FDIC's current process tracking retention records, employee retention records? Anybody know?
So my understanding is that there are projects to improve these. Again, I think, but as board members, our focus is we really need to change both structure
No,
and
Mr.
culture.
Sue, because I know when people start leaving, right, something's wrong. Like, you know how you know? So I'm trying to figure out what percentage of employees who leave the FDIC complete exit surveys. What are we doing there? Because that can always help with indicating whether or not there's a pattern of sexual harassment, there is something wrong, there's, getting to the root cause of turnover, whatever you want to call it. Again, we're talking about retention and how important exit interviews are.
Yes. I believe that's been identified in the report as something that needs to be improved as part of the action plan in concert with these other steps. They all have to move together.
But there are doing exit interviews right now.
I have to get back to you. We have to get back to you on that.
You don't do exit interviews right now?
I don't want to misspeak.
Okay.
I want to make sure we get back to.
That's really important. And especially in such a large organization right now, especially, yep, thank you, Mr. Chair, I yield.
Stop these wild swings in policies, the better off we're going to be. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. You enforced the law. What is it, $183 million you got for our veterans? Yes. I mean, come on, corporations, businesses, follow the law. Follow the law and it won't cost you any money. Now, I know you're not going to be able to say that to my colleague, but it's true. I mean, look at this. 39 public enforcement actions involved harm to service members and veterans, including 6 enforcement actions of violations of the Military Lending Act. My God. Corporate greed is on array here in our country. It is. I mean, look, it's not like, poof, the money is it's going to our residents. It's going to our constituents and our families. I mean, I'm just looking at all of this, like which is crazy, the amount of money our banks were just banking off our residents. That $6.1 billion, you were able to literally go after these large, big banks that some of them have business plans that over 50%, I don't know, maybe that's the credit card companies, over 50% of their business plan was overdrafts and fees. That's what it was. They were making money off of charging our residents these fees. I mean, it's not like you can take this money away from them if they applied it under the law, correct? They were violating consumer law. It's not, that's what you're doing. So if we have a new administration, that's what's going to happen. Nothing. Do you know how many times I sent various cases, Ranking Member Rodgers, you know how many cases I sent around service loan folks with student loan issues? Oh my God, the loan servicers were out of whack. I mean, give me a break. So I want to talk about bye-bye medical debt on credit reports. I am so incredibly happy to see that. One of the things that I think, Director, what really was just mind-boggling is hearing my residents talk about the fact that they would have to file bankruptcy, all of these things, because it was weighing down on them being able to access, housing, employment, and so forth. Can you talk, and I know this from the study that you all showed, when you did the study, it showed, the significant impact on our American families across the country to have medical debt on their credit report. But it was really an inaccurate, picture of someone's risk profile. It really was. Somebody gets sick, and it gets on their credit report. Having that weigh down as if they bought some poor, I don't know, some car, I'm not very good at the car stuff, but something expensive, a luxury item. So, Director, let's talk about that burden and what this is going to do. How is it going to transform the families around the country?
Well, I think it's going to reduce so much of the harms, especially from inaccurate credit reporting of medical bills, which really debt collectors are not able to.
You got to explain that because you're really good at this. Explain that because people don't get it. It gets on their credit report and it was incorrect.
Yes, I think this is the difference. There's so much problems when you park this medical bills there. It may still be being adjudicated by an insurance company, and on top of that, no one is seeking out to have medical debt. You borrow money for a car because you want to get the car to get to work. You borrow money to get a home. You borrow money for an education. You're not just sort of eager to get medical debt. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's so many different facets of this. So we studied carefully the differences, and we have proposed also being more in line with what Congress wanted was to restrict medical information on people's credit reports. And I think this is a reasonable intervention to stop a lot of the inaccuracies. I think one of your colleagues said, well, can't they dispute it? How long will it take to deal with that? And what will the harm be when you're applying for that loan.
I mean, I think our chairman of our committee was talking about having to dispute it because I guess he actually paid his his bill and it still somehow ended
So
up.
many people pay it just
Yes.
because they want the abuse to stop.
Yeah. Director, what are some of the coercive practices that debt collectors currently engage in, such as debt parking?
Well, so
Explain that to the American public.
Debt parking is where you put a debt on someone's credit report in the hopes that you can coerce them into paying to remove
You're
it,
too nice. You mean bully them?
even if you don't even owe it or you've never even
Yes.
heard of it. And by the way, so much of the public has also paid one of those debts, even if they didn't owe it.
It's unbelievable. Another concerning practice, of course, is increasing use of medical credit cards and financing plans. I mean, corporate greed is just coming up with all kinds of various inventions. Just to be clear, Director, this week's proposed rule doesn't affect debts paid to medical credit card issuers, does it?
Yeah, if you pay a medical expense with a credit card,
Yeah.
any type of credit card, that will be classified separately and is not covered.
I think that's something we should actually look at together, but I really appreciate this. I just don't want my families, it's not their fault they got sick. They're just seeking help, and, medical debt, again, shouldn't be weighing down our families. Thank you so much. I yield.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Session, is now recognized.
Chairman, thank you very much, Mr. Troper. You're almost at the end of this visit that you got with us, and thank you for taking time, not just informationally to be with us, but I think your attitude I appreciate very, very much.
She's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary, for being here. As you probably know, many of the countries in the global south are facing a tremendous debt burden. I think that's almost half of the world's population right now. About 3.3 billion people are impacted by this, living in countries that spend more on the interest on their debts than the healthcare or education in their communities. And an IMF issues fees called surcharges on heavily indebted countries. Secretary Tlaib, do you believe that developing countries suffering through perfect, storm of global crises, including shocks to the food and fuel prices, soaring interest rates, climate change, and so much more, should be required to pay these fees on top of the interest they pay on their debt?
Well, the surcharges framework, we think, is important to create appropriate incentives to repay the IMF in a timely way and to contain borrowings. But the IMF, with our support, is currently reviewing
That's right. Do you
this,
support
this
that review?
policy.
Do you support that review?
Yes, we are supportive of the review.
Can you explain to our residents what the special drawing rights are at the IMF?
Special drawing rights are essentially a system in which countries agree to provide lines. The way I think of it is providing countries with additional lines of credit that are in proportion to their quotas at the IMF. And
I love telling my residents that it would provide immediate relief to countries across the globe while costing the U.S. payer nothing, absolutely nothing. Is that correct? Does it cost our U.S. taxpayer any money?
No, we earn interest on if we provide hard currency for special drawing rights, we earn interest on that, and it doesn't cost us anything.
And Secretary Yellen, I've heard is the United States actually standing in the way of new issuance or looking at the special drawing rights?
Well, we thought at the onset and after the pandemic struck, which hit so many countries, created a global shortage of liquidity, that an SDR allocation was appropriate, and one took place, a large SDR allocation. At this point, we don't think an SDR allocation is needed or appropriate.
So you don't think a new issuance is required? I mean, I don't want to send a message that our country, Secretary, that our message to developing countries that the U.S. is unwilling to respond to the debt crisis.
We've been very supportive of an expansion of the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust
But why not
Congress.
just help? But why not just help them? I don't understand.
Well, it does help them because it gives them interest-free loans to the countries that are most in need.
So more debt. So the way the international financial institutions are governed is inconsistent.
Well, it's debt. SDRs in a way are debt too, because
I know,
countries that use them do have to pay interest on them. So it's not that different.
Yeah, the way the international financial institutions are governed is inconsistent with the democratic ideals we seek at home. And in the IMF, for example, the US and other G7 countries get 41% of votes, despite only having 10% of the global population. So Secretary Yellen, what would you say to countries who feel we don't practice that what we preach when it comes to democratic decision-making in the international financial institution?
So we have certainly been supportive of governance reforms that increase the role and the voice of borrowing countries so that they have more say in representation. We've supported adding directors who represent low-income countries, and we've supported the idea of reviewing the formula that would determine quota allocations in the future. We've been opposed to ad hoc quota review that would reallocate in a sort of ad hoc way voting rights, but we are supportive of the IMF reviewing the formula that determines voting rights.
Thank you, Secretary. I yield.
Ms. Tlaib is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eliminating unnecessary regulatory burdens is a worthy goal. I get it. But we must also not lose sight of the fact that stewardship of public funds, getting the corporate welfare line, right? You're asking us to finance it, that it often demands us to have fair and effective regulations. In 1973, early disability rights legislation known as the Rehabilitation Act was passed. Section 504 of the bill ensured that people with disabilities couldn't be excluded from programs that receive federal assistance. Yet activists and advocates had to push for years for Section 504 regulations to actually be implemented, even going as far as having to do sit-ins and occupy federal buildings across the nation to get us to do what we promised. Today, one of the regulations still being fought right now is the proposed affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. So Senior Vice President Couch, can you please discuss, and I think it's important for all the folks that do this work, what it means for people, especially our neighbors living with disabilities, who have faced over and over again discrimination, including, again, in regards to the importance of implementing, going as far as trying to support affirmatively furthering fair housing rule.
So in yet another, thank you for the question, Congresswoman, in yet another attempt to really put some teeth and to move forward on the Fair Housing Act's authority to for HUD to push for affirmatively furthering fair housing, this administration in January of 2023, I think it was, proposed its version of affirmatively furthering rules, and leading aides submitted comments to that proposed rule in support of the administration's efforts. What affirmatively furthering fair housing means in this iteration, or would mean if we could ever get it actually enacted and enforced, is that communities, and I think now housing authorities and multifamily providers like our members, we would encourage our members to participate in those processes, would have to demonstrate to HUD that they are actually not just complying with federal fair housing laws around accessibility requirements and other classes that are regularly discriminated against, but that they are furthering the efforts to meet the gap in where those housing needs are in their community, or risk HUD funds being pulled back. And we've done a lot of talk about, the federal government does this, you get that. The federal government does this.
I mean, it's banks do that all the time.
Right, and so there's a quid pro quo there, right? We have lots of goals, and some of them include furthering fair housing goals.
And I'll tell you, I don't think Republican, Democrat, whatever you political, I don't think any of us have had a coffee hour outreach where we didn't have one of our disabled neighbors talking about housing issues and discrimination and not getting access. I do want to quickly talk about the new energy standards, which everyone is continuing to talk about. You know, I know a single family owner might see an annual mortgage payment go up by, what, $247, but the annual energy savings will be about $751, meaning they'll save over like, what, $14,000 over a lifetime of their property on average. With the new energy standards, a family living in a low, rise multifamily unit can save up to $314 annually on energy costs. And I'll tell you, I watch GTE. I think they're on their fourth. This is the energy. They're already increasing. I think this is the fourth increase in the year that we've been seeing. Again, it's gone to the point where we're seeing more record shutoffs and stuff. So, Vice President Couch, in a written statement, you mentioned how older households served by HUD Section 202 program have an annual income of what, just a little bit over $16,000. For someone in that situation, what might be better building standards mean for their physical and financial health?
Quite a bit. I mean, as I understand these new minimum energy standards coming from USDA and EPA, which again just apply to the federally backed programs, we're going to see those reduced energy cost savings for residents, and that's going to matter deeply in their pocketbooks when they have so little residual income left over after they do pay their rent. We're going to see increased resident health because of those air quality issues we mentioned a little while ago. We do think that buildings will be much more resilient to climate change and weather events, which will bring down the cost to the federal government to repair those and rebuild those buildings. And generally, we see decreased climate change, and those can benefit all of us.
And I really truly believe if you're getting federal financing or support, I think it's okay to ask for something in return, especially protections for our residents. I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Michigan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. The pretense of today's hearing is that certain risks don't matter for companies or the families and retirees who invested in them. And apparently today, a company's social or governance practices, like whether they have effective policies for preventing and addressing sexual harassment, don't matter. However, when the FTC chair was here before this committee, it was obvious that everyone cared. Treasurer, to effectively carry out their responsibilities, what types of information, risks, or opportunities must fiduciaries consider? And I'm so sorry if you've been asked this question, but I think it's important to repeat why these factors are important.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Let me first start by explaining why we need new data. About 50 years ago, in 1975, the S&P 500 had about 17% of the value in the S&P 500 in intangible assets. Today, that number is about 90%. So the nature of value of companies have changed. 50 years ago, you could look at a car company in Michigan and say, well, how many employees do they have? How many cars are they producing a year? How many factories they have? You could look at these numbers. But today, Apple, the value of Apple is not $1 trillion because of the number of iPhones they're producing. It's based on their reputation, on their intellectual property. And these are things that are subject to additional new risks, reputational risk, litigation risks. These are things that we need to have this information for because we're making lots of investments in these companies, and we want to know, we don't want to put our clients' money in investments at risk.
No, you answered my next question. I mean, the anti-ESG movement is funded by the fossil fuel industry, which is poisoning my community. Figures like Leonard Leo and I think Peter Thiel, who are all seeking to line their pockets, to protect their profits by opening a new front in what many are calling the culture war, right? The issue might be fabricated, but the stakes are truly, really real for people not only within the company, but for so many of the folks that are impacted. The retirement savings for hardworking families and public funding are all on the line. After Texas passed their anti-ESG legislation in 2021, for example, disrupting the municipal bond market, look it up, public borrowing costs increased by roughly $400 million after they passed the anti-ESG legislation. Indiana's budget office has estimated that forcing pension funds to divest from firms or funds that use ESG factors could reduce returns by $6.7 billion. Again, documented. Treasurer, can you discuss how attempts to prevent the use of environmental, social, and governance factors can cost the public and the retirees?
So let's say there was talk earlier about these small mom and pop companies out there. What we're talking about today is our large publicly traded companies.
That's
The
right.
reason we have disclosures is because in the past they didn't disclose things and defrauded investors. Now, we have risks for us investors. We need to know what they are. If there's an individual small company providing a widget for a large international company, we should have access to know, is that widget made with child labor? Is it made with slave labor? Because that presents a real risk to our investment in a company like Apple. I mean, just think of all those people who have iPhones. The number of people, if they found out those iPhones were being made by slave Uyghur labor in China, by children, there were people who would switch from iPhones to Androids. It'd be a big risk to the company. That's why this access to information for reputational risk and litigation risk.
Look, it's very
is so
obvious.
important.
It's about shielding them from accountability. Let's just be honest. This is shielding them from accountability. If a company is facing significant climate-related risks, investors need to know. I mean, period. Why not?
If you're an insurance
Transparency.
company.
Be honest. I don't know why we're trying to help them hide this information. It's ridiculous. Treasurer, last question. Can you discuss some of the issues? I mean, the climate risks always come to mind for folks, but for climate risk to executive compensation, that shareholders' proposals can force companies to disclose, and why those issues would be of interest to investors. I know it's clear, but I think folks, I love how you give examples. I think the American people need to understand implementation-wise why this matters.
There was talk about materiality. So not every company is impacted by climate risk as others. If you're an insurance company insuring homes along the Florida coast, as an investor, we want to know that risk. If you're in agriculture and there are droughts or floods coming into your farm areas, we need to know your exposure there because those are real risks out there.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I yield.
Gentleladies has yielded back. With that, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, is right.
Mr. Chair. Chair Gensler, I was looking, is like from 2010 to 2019, companies spent, what, $6.3 trillion on stock buybacks. Is that a lot?
Well,
Like compared to, I'm not in the industry, is that a lot for compared?
where I come from in Baltimore, when you're talking trillions, it's always a lot. But over 10 years.
My staff made sure to say that's with the capital like T. So.
Yeah. But over 10 years, I think you said $600 billion a year.
Mm-hmm.
Given that we have a $50 trillion equity stock market, the numbers sound about right.
Mm-hmm. Is it true that the average corporate executive receives a larger share of their compensation in actually stock awards and stock options more than even their salary?
I believe that to be correct.
Yeah, I think one study showed that the average executive receives nearly 27.3% of their total compensations in salary, but 4.3% in bonuses, within 30.6% in stock awards, and about 12.6% in options. One of the things is about the lack of transparency and how some of these decisions are made, but to make matters worse, some investors in the public have been largely kind of in the dark about the specifics of stock buybacks and the reasons be the companies and how they engage in them. Given all this, I was really pleased to see last year that the SEC finalized an important rule bringing much needed disclosures, as you know, and transparency to very, very, again, very murky practice of stock buybacks. We know, unfortunately, the Fifth Circuit struck it down. So, Chair, do you have any commitment that you can share of whether or not you're going to be reproposing the stock buyback rule?
I thought it was an important rule and voted for its adoption. The Fifth Circuit saw it differently. We took it back to reconsider. It's still on our unified agenda as part of our agenda. We'd have to propose a new rule.
Do you have a timeline?
I don't have a timeline for you.
Like in a year?
Well, I would hope, again, elections have consequences, so.
I know.
But if I'm here and so forth, I think this is an important rule. I think it's important to have greater transparency. And that where we had adopted was once a quarter, the companies would provide greater transparency on the shares they bought in the prior quarter.
Is this a true statement that not all stock buybacks are legal? Stock buybacks can't be used to evade security laws, for instance.
I can think of hypotheticals where you could try to do a stock buyback that evaded securities laws, but I would hope that everybody does them legally.
They won't unless you force them, Chair. Come on. So if anything, is the SEC doing anything to ensure public companies' stock buybacks practices are not violating current law?
We're a cop on the beat. It's part of what we do. We have robust enforcement. If any of your constituents or anybody has information or belief if somebody's doing buybacks that are illegal, bring it to our attention.
So, Chair, you know this. My favorite section of Dodd-Frank lately has been Section 956. And it's been about, 13 years, and we're still waiting for regulators to finalize this rule preventing compensation packages that encourage excessive risk-taking. And, it impacts our small businesses recently and others when we, again, don't move forward on what the legislative intent is. And so several regulators recently proposed a I think it was 2016 version of the rule, but not all the agencies joined, as you probably know. At its discretion, SEC sometimes performs an economic analysis or cost-benefit analysis for this is to Commissioner Lazaro, is that what I'm saying? Yeah, say it for me, please. Lazari. Do you need all other regulators on board before conducting such an analysis? So basically, this is one thing that SEC, maybe Chair can help you, can perform what they call economic analysis on certain rules and cost benefit.
That is a function performed by our Division of Economic and Risk Analysis. The staff of the Commission is part of our
Really
rulemaking.
quickly, Chair, because we're...
And we would need to do an economic analysis, and we would put it out to public comment in this joint rule.
But do you need all the companies?
Gentlelady's time's expired. I will now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin.